Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica from Confessions of a Homeschooler, and today I'm going to continue on with my quilting series. We're going to talk about how to piece fabric. Now, when you're talking about quilting, people tend to think of it as sort of an overall project of creating something similar to this behind me. When people are talking about piecing a quilt, what they're really referring to is creating the top, kind of like the pretty side of your quilt. So piecing a quilt essentially means taking smaller pieces, sewing them together to create sort of an overall design like one of these stars. The quilting of your quilt is actually when you take your top, your pieced top, layer it together with some batting and some backing, and then sew a nice pattern or design or whatever on top of the quilt as a whole. So on this one, I'm not sure if you can see, but I did kind of a little meandering quilting design, and I'm going to show you how to do free motion quilting in another video. But today I'm going to be talking about how to piece the top half of your quilt. And so there's going to be some just tips and tricks that I found that are helpful when piecing, some things that make my sewing go a little bit faster, and then just some other helpful tips as far as how to read patterns and what you're going to find when you're looking at a pattern and it's telling you to do certain things. Now, one of the most important parts of piecing a quilt top is getting a 1/4 inch seam. And so my best suggestion on getting something that's consistent is to go out and get a 1/4 inch piecing foot if your machine has not come with one. The more consistent you are, that will ensure that your quilt will be more consistent when you start putting those pieces together to form your larger overall design. If you think about it kind of in the grand scheme of things, say some of your pieces are actually pieced at a 1/4 inch while some of your other pieces might be slightly more or slightly less. When you start trying to fit all those pieces together, they should interlock like a puzzle really nice and tightly. If your seams are not consistent, you're going to start having issues with seams lining up, things aren't going to fit properly. So think about it like this. If you have 4 different sections that you're sewing together, and if each one of those sections is, say, 1/8 inch, little bit like wider than a 1/4 inch, by the time you get all 4 of those pieces together, you're going to be close to a 1/2 inch short on your overall block. So you really want to be careful. That's probably the best advice I can give you when you're first starting out, is to do your best to get a nice 1/4 inch seam, and then all of your blocks will line up beautifully. Now, a little bit of error here and there happens, and I still don't have a perfect 1/4 inch seam on all of my quilts. As long as it's like 1/8 inch or so, like on your edges of your finished piece, you can kind of hide that in your seam allowance. So there are tricks to kind of working around it a little bit, but you really do want to do your best to get a nice overall 1/4 inch seam. Now, this 1/4 inch foot that I have has some markings on it to help me. If you do not have a 1/4 inch foot, there's some other options. A lot of time your sewing machine will have an option to be able to move your needle to the right or to the left, and you can just sew some samples and then just measure it with your ruler to see which place gives you the closest to a 1/4 inch. The other thing that I've done in the past is put a piece of masking tape on my actual sewing face plate, and then I can use that as a guide for my my seam allowance. So there's a couple different things you can do if you don't order a 1/4 inch foot, or if you don't feel like going out and purchasing one. But like I said, those are just my tips. Go for the best 1/4 inch seam you can, and that will just really make your quilting life a whole lot easier. So now let's go ahead and head over to my sewing machine. I'm going to show you some other tips and tricks I have for sewing faster, and things that just are going to kind of make quilting just a little bit easier overall. So let's go take a look at those. Move into some of the sewing tips, I wanted to cover common quilting terms that you may encounter in your patterns. The first one is a 1/4 inch SA, and what that stands for is seam allowance, and you can pretty much assume that you're going to be doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance on all of your projects unless it's otherwise stated in the pattern. WOF stands for width of fabric, and that's from salvage edge to salvage edge. The bias means that you're going to cut your fabric at a 45-degree angle across, which will give you a more stretchy piece of fabric. And if you saw my fabric video, you can see that there. FQ stands for fat 1/4, and those are typically 18 inches by 22 inches. F8 stands for fat 1/8, and those are 9 inches by 22 inches. FMQ stands for free motion quilting, and that's the fun design you get to do on the top of your quilt when you're done. HST stands for half square triangle. It's a very common block in quilting. A border is just a frame that you're going to put around your finished quilt. I like to use borders to make my quilts a little bit bigger if I need to, or sometimes just give them a little extra framing. Sashing are strips that you sew in between your quilt blocks, and those can either be plain strips or you can make them decorative. RST and WST stands for right sides together, wrong sides together. Normally you will always be sewing right sides together so that when you open them up, the pretty side will be showing. US usually refers to your local quilt shop. OOP is for out of print fabric. That's usually something that's a little bit older and hard to find. BOM stands for block of the month, and that's usually when you are mailed a block every month, and by the time you're done getting all of the blocks in the kit, you'll have enough to make a fun quilt top with. LAQ can either refer to a long arm quilter, the person, or the actual machine, and those are those big machines that roll the quilts up and then you actually move the machine to quilt your quilts. WIP stands for work in progress. We all have plenty of those. And UFO stands for unfinished objects, which we also have plenty of. Fussy cutting means you're going to take a piece of fabric and then carefully cut out a specific portion of that fabric for your quilt. Basting is when you layer your backing, batting, and your quilt top together and then get it ready to quilt. And binding is the final strip of fabric that's sewn around the edge of your quilt to finish off the edges. If you're going to be doing a lot of quilting, I highly suggest that you get a 1/4 inch foot. This particular one is for my machine. It's a low shank machine, and the foot actually drops off here like this. But what it is it has this 1/4 inch right here, and there's also a 1/4 inch mark right here. So this width right here is a 1/4 inch, and then that line right there lets me know when I'm a 1/4 inch away from the edge of my material. So this is very important as far as getting a good 1/4 inch seam allowance when you start quilting. If your machine does not have one of these, I highly recommend that you find one that fits your machine. There's kind of lots of different styles out there. This is just the one that kind of fit my machine, and so I went with it, but I actually do really like it, and I highly recommend this. If you're trying to eyeball a 1/4 inch, or remember to scoot your needle over to make it a 1/4 inch and just use a regular foot, it can be really difficult to get like a nice straight line. So I really do highly recommend this for sure if you're going to be doing a lot of quilting. Alright, so for most piecing, you're just going to want to use a straight stitch, and this is my straight stitch for my machine. It's just 0, 0. It lists it at a 3.5 stitch width, but since it's a straight stitch, it's really not a stitch width. It doesn't matter. And then it also automatically sets it to 2.4 stitch length. So I find that that works for me. I know a lot of people recommend 2.0 stitch length. So you just don't want it too small that you can't pick out your stitches if you mess up, and you don't want it too large that your pieces are falling apart. So this setting works great for my machine. You're just going to want to see what is the recommended setting for straight stitch on your machine. Another helpful tool when you are piecing is having a stitch guide on your machine. Now, like I mentioned before, you can put a piece of tape on here. That works really well. This is called Sew Perfect Angles, and this is just a kind of a, you know, one of those acrylic adhesive pieces, and it just lays right on my Sew Steady table and adheres to my machine as well. And then that helps me with my 1/4 inch foot. It also helps when I'm doing a diagonal piecing, which I'll show you in just a minute as well. So this is a really handy tool, but like I said, if you don't have this and you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, you can always measure with a ruler, do a few sample stitches, and then just lay a piece of masking tape or painter's tape just right here on your machine and use that as your guide as well. So you can see here I'm using my guide to sew a diagonal, and instead of having to draw lines on all of my blocks, I can just run the point right down the tip there and then know that I'm going to get a nice straight diagonal line. So that's a handy tool to have. One thing I really like to do to help save time when I'm piecing is cut out all my material first, and as you can see, I label them with these little alphabetties, and it makes it really nice and organized. And then if I have a few minutes here and there to sew, I can come in and just grab my pieces really easy and sew up a few pieces and then leave and come back to it. So this has really helped speed up my quilting process. Alright, so when you're quilting, you always want to make sure that you're quilting with your fabrics right sides together, and all that means is that this pretty side of your fabric, where the print actually is the right side. The back side is going to be what's called the wrong side. So when you're sewing two pieces of fabric together, you're going to put the right sides together, sew them together, and then that way when you go to iron them apart, the nice sides will be showing out. You obviously don't want to have the wrong side of your fabric facing up because that's kind of the ugly side, and we want to see the pretty side. So that's all that right sides together means. Now if you're using solids, as you can see, it's very difficult to tell which one is the right side, so I typically don't worry about it unless it's extremely obvious. For the most part on whites, it's very difficult to tell, and it's not really going to matter if you have the wrong side out. So you won't have to worry about it as much on solid prints as you will on actual, or solid fabric as you will on an actual print. Alright, so often you'll hear people talking about chain piecing. And chain piecing just means that you're going to run several pieces of your material through your machine before you bother cutting your thread. And that saves a lot of time. It also saves some thread as well, especially depending on what kind of a machine you have. So I basically have all my pieces pre-cut and ready to go, and I have some of them kind of lined up over here on the side. And I'm going to go ahead and just start chain piecing them together. So now as you can see, I'm not going to cut my thread. I'm just going to go through, grab my next piece, line it up, and keep going. Grab my next one, keep going. So as you can see, this actually moves along quite quickly, and if you have all of your fabrics already cut out, it makes for really quick sewing and you get your blocks done quite quickly. It's definitely much faster to do it this way than to cut out one block at a time, sew one block at a time, and alright, so when you're done, you'll have this nice little string of blocks together, and all you have to do is just snip them apart and you're good to go. And that makes for really fast sewing and makes it a lot easier to get a lot of blocks put together in a short amount of time. Alright, one other thing I like to do to kind of help speed up my cutting is I'll line up several blocks at a time, whatever I can kind of fit on my cutting board, and then I pick one of my inch markers and I line up my stitch line right on that inch marker. Then I can take my ruler and place my 1/4 inch marker on that line, or I'll make sure that it's also not cutting into my seams just in case one of them gets mixed around. But anyways, then you can take your cutter and cut 3 blocks at one time. They're all 1/4 inch from your seam line, and it's just a little bit of a faster way to do that. So I'll often line up several blocks at once just to get my cutting done quicker. Alright, so as you can kind of see here, when you're chain piecing, it typically means that you're working on several blocks at once. So these are just 4 of the 9 blocks that I'm making right now, but I've sewed them all kind of at the same time. So that means when you're done, you're kind of going to be finishing all of your blocks at once, as opposed to sewing one block at a time and then moving over and sewing another block. So another thing I like to do to save time is I know I have to sew corners onto both of these pieces. So instead of taking these over to the board, cutting them, ironing them all out, and then sewing this one on, I'll just leave this one on, go ahead and sew on this other side, and then when I'm done going through all of these pieces, then I will take them over, cut them all at once, and iron them all at once. And that just kind of saves on time. So just another little tip. Alright, so once you're done sewing these little corners on, in quilting anyways, unless it's otherwise indicated, you're always going to cut 1/4 inch away from your stitch line. So what I like to do, hopefully you can see this, is take my stitch line right there, and then I have this 1/4 inch line on my ruler, and I will just line that right up on there, and then just trim that off like that. And then hopefully you can see that I've got my stitch line right here, and then 1/4 inch fabric. If at all possible, you want to make sure you have 1/4 inch. If you get a little bit bigger, it's just going to make your seam a little more bulky. If you get too close to your stitch line, you run the risk of the fabric fraying and then it actually coming apart, you know, just because you don't have enough fabric to kind of hold the stitch line together. So it's just a good rule of thumb, cut 1/4 inch away from your stitch line when you're piecing for quilting. So one other little tip I wanted to share with you when you're doing snowballing a corner. And snowballing a corner just means that you're taking a square piece, sewing diagonal along another piece, and then you'll be flipping it out, creating this kind of diagonal effect on the corner of the piece. So normally patterns will tell you to mark a line from corner to corner, and since I have this little guide here, I don't have to do that anymore. But what I'm going to do, and I just kind of eyeball it a little bit, is I actually will sew right to the side of this line instead of directly on it. That way it makes room for my seam allowance when I go to flip this corner out. So you're going to want to sew to the side that you're going to be cutting off. You don't want to sew towards the side that you're going to be keeping. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And so What I'm going to do is just drop this down, and hopefully you can see, but my line is actually lining up with my foot as opposed to my needle. And I'm just going to sew just right to the left of that line right there. And hopefully you can see that. Okay, and then that way when I go and cut off my 1/4 of an inch over here and I go to iron this open, it's actually going to make a little bit of room for that crease right there, and then hopefully my block will be slightly more accurate as well. You'll find quickly that if you sew too far to the inside of your block, when you go to flip open your little piece right here, your block is actually going to be slightly short. If you don't do it too badly, it's usually not a big deal. It'll get covered up in the seam allowance if it's not perfect. You just want to be careful you don't do it too much. Otherwise, you can really change the size of your block, and then this little section right here won't actually be big enough for your seam allowance. So just be careful. That's just a little tip I've learned. So just a hair to the outside that you're going to be cutting off whenever you're doing one of these diagonal type blocks. So one fun little quilting tool that I have are these friction erasable pins, and I just get these on Amazon. I've also seen them in local stores, but they disappear with heat. Now they do reappear with cool, so you kind of need to be careful. Sometimes if you're going to, if you want to use these on, say, the front of your quilt when you're quilting to mark your lines to follow, I would be careful, especially if you're planning on shipping that quilt to someone, or you know, putting it on a truck and sending it to like Quilt Market or something like that. The lines can actually reappear, so be very careful with that. However, they're great to use when you're having to mark blocks for your seams. Now hopefully you can see this on here, but I'll draw a few more little squigglies for you, and hopefully you can see that. But you can just write right on the fabric, and then when you hit it with your iron, it literally just disappears. So that's a nice way to be able to mark your fabric without having to, you know, wash it. There's also other pins that are water soluble and things like that, but I really do like these friction pins, especially if it's going to be, like I said, in a seam line where you're not going to see it even if it does reappear when it gets cold out. But you do just want to be careful about marking the tops of your quilt using these. So it's just something to be aware of. I did a quilt for my husband's grandma, and I used this to mark some embroidery lines on there, and then I ironed it off and rewrote the lines just because I didn't like where they were, and then she keeps it out in her front room, which is actually quite cool. And unfortunately the pink line has re-showed up on there. She doesn't seem to mind, but it bugs me every time I go over there. So just something to be aware of with these pins. Otherwise, they're a great asset to have in your quilting toolbox. The last thing I want to talk about in quilting is called nesting your seams. And when you've got a couple of blocks sewn and you need to sew them together, the best thing to do is to iron the seams in opposite directions. And then as you can see here, I've got one seam to the right, the bottom seam is going to the left. And then I usually like to pin at my seams as well. And that really just ensures that when you stitch those blocks together and then go to iron them open, you'll get a nice crisp point where your seams meet, and everything will look nice and neat and pretty. So I just wanted to put in a quick little segment here on seam ripping, because if you're brand new to sewing, then you may not know how to do this. There's lots of different ways to seam rip, so I just want to show you a couple. You can start by pulling your fabric just gently apart and kind of picking your stitches this way. I don't like to do this because what happens is it leaves a lot of little tiny stitches, and then it kind of leaves little threads all over your material. The other thing you can do is take this red ball and kind of put it underneath and kind of pull it like that through the material, which is fast, but again, you end up with all these little kind of tiny threads everywhere. So my favorite way to seam rip, and also you can also tear your fabric that way, because that is quite sharp, and if you accidentally catch it in your seam ripper, you can rip a hole in your fabric. So what I tend to do is put my the pointy end of my seam ripper through a stitch, and then using the non-sharp end kind of pull it out. And as hopefully you can see that I'm just putting it in and then pulling it out, so it's not actually cutting the thread. I just slowly, and you can kind of get faster as you go. The main reason that I like to seam rip like this is because, as you can see, I pulled out my thread in one nice big chunk, and same situation on the back. Your thread comes out in one nice big long piece, and you don't have all those little tiny pieces. You also don't have any worries of pulling or cutting your fabric accidentally. So I hope that helps on your seam ripping. So those are my helpful tips and tricks on piecing quilting. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at eric@confessionsofahomeschooler.com and I will do my best to help you out. Now, Fat Quarter Shop is sponsoring another fun giveaway for today's video, and today I'm giving away this really cool sew line butterfly marking tool. Now, this is great for marking when you're doing diagonal lines on your blocks like I showed, or you can also use it to mark the top of your quilt when you're getting ready to quilt it. And the lines from this tool come off using the eraser that comes with it or by dabbing it carefully with just a damp towel. So if you'd like to win this prize, go ahead and head over to my blog. I will put a link in the post description box below for you, and you can enter to win this. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you for the next one.